The Dancing Plague of 1518. The summer of 1518 arrived in Strasbourg like any other, carrying with it the familiar weight of heat and hunger. The Rhine flowed past the city's walls as it had for centuries, indifferent to human suffering, while inside those walls, something impossible was about to begin. It started with one woman. Her name was Frau Troffea, though history has preserved little else about her. We don't know if she was young or old, wealthy or poor, happy or desperately sad. We know only that on a July day in 1518, she stepped into the narrow street outside her home and began to dance. Not the dancing of celebration or joy, not the measured steps of a feast day, or the graceful movements of a courtly ball. This was something else entirely, something urgent and strange and terribly wrong. She danced alone in the street, her feet moving without rest, her body jerking and spinning as if pulled by invisible strings. Hour after hour she danced, through the afternoon heat and into the evening cool. When darkness fell, she continued. When her husband pleaded with her to stop, she could not. When dawn came again, she was still dancing. By the third day, others had joined her. The medieval mind understood the world differently than we do now. In 1518, Strasbourg was a city caught between worlds, no longer wholly medieval, not yet truly modern. The Protestant Reformation was spreading through the Germanic lands, challenging centuries of Catholic certainty. Crops had failed repeatedly in recent years. Disease moved through the narrow streets with grim regularity. The people lived with hunger, with fear, with the constant awareness of their own fragility. They believed in saints and demons, in divine punishment and miraculous intervention. They believed that God watched their every action, that angels and devils contested for their souls, that the world was alive with supernatural forces just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. So when Frau Troffea began her terrible dance, the people of Strasbourg searched for meaning in the movement. Was it possession, punishment, a curse laid by an enemy? They watched and wondered, horrified and fascinated, as one woman's inexplicable behavior transformed into something much larger. Within a week, 34 people were dancing. By the end of the month, the number had swollen to somewhere between 50 and 400 souls. The records from that chaotic summer are incomplete, contradictory, written by scribes who could barely believe what they were witnessing. The dancers moved through the streets in a terrible parade, their feet bleeding, their faces twisted with exhaustion, and something that might have been terror or ecstasy or both. They danced in the market square and along the river. They danced through the heat of day and the relief of night. They danced until they collapsed, and then, after brief periods of rest, they rose and danced again. The city's response reveals the profound confusion of that moment. The magistrates and guild leaders consulted with physicians, who proposed a theory that seems almost absurd to modern ears. The dancing was caused by hot blood. The cure, they reasoned, was more dancing. If the afflicted could dance continuously, they would eventually dance the fever from their systems. So the city built stages. They hired musicians. They encouraged the dancers, believing that this organized dancing would somehow purge whatever poison had infected the city's people. They were trying to solve a problem they couldn't understand with tools that made sense in their worldview, where balance and humors governed health, where excess could be cured by indulgence. It didn't work. The dancing continued. The dancers spun and leaped and staggered through the August heat. Their clothing grew ragged. Their shoes wore through. Blood marked their paths through the dusty streets. Some collapsed and never rose again, whether from exhaustion, heart failure, or sheer despair, we cannot know. The medieval chronicles speak vaguely of deaths, though they offer no precise numbers, no detailed accounts. Perhaps even the scribes found it too terrible to document fully. Imagine standing in a street in Strasbourg on an August afternoon in 1518. The sun beats down on the half-timbered houses, their wooden frames dark against whitewashed walls. The smell of unwashed bodies in open sewers mingles with the sweetness of baking bread from a nearby bakery. And through the square, a woman stumbles past, her face vacant, her feet moving in patterns that might once have resembled dancing, but now look more like the jerking of a marionette whose strings are tangled. Behind her, another dancer, and another. A man who might be 40 or might be 60. It's hard to tell beneath the dirt and exhaustion. a young woman whose fine dress suggests she comes from a merchant family, now torn and stained beyond repair. An old man whose white hair streams behind him as he spins, his mouth open in what might be a scream or a laugh, or simply desperate gasping for air. The musicians play on their wooden stages, their melodies growing more frantic, as if speed and volume might somehow break the spell. But the dancers don't follow the music's rhythm. They move to something else, some beat that only they can hear, some command that overrides exhaustion and pain, and every human instinct for self-preservation. The city's religious authorities offered a different explanation. This was divine punishment, they declared, sent by Saint Vitus for the sins of the people. Strasbourg had grown too worldly, too concerned with commerce and comfort, too lax in its devotions. The dancing plague was God's warning, his way of calling his people back to righteousness. And so, in late August or early September, again, the records disagree, the authorities changed their approach. They dismantled the stages, they banned the music, they sent the dancers on a pilgrimage to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus in the nearby Vosges Mountains, hoping that the saint's intercession might end what human intervention could not. And then, as mysteriously as it had begun, the dancing stopped. By early September, the streets of Strasbourg were quiet again. The dancers had recovered or died or disappeared into the anonymity of medieval record-keeping. Life returned to something resembling normal as life could be in a city that had just watched hundreds of its citizens dance themselves to exhaustion and sometimes death. But what had actually happened? That question has echoed across 5 centuries, and we still don't have a completely satisfying answer. Modern scholars have proposed various theories. Some suggest ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on rye in damp conditions and contains compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning, known as St. Anthony's fire in the Middle Ages, could cause convulsions, hallucinations, and involuntary movements. But ergot typically causes constriction of blood vessels and gangrenous symptoms, not sustained dancing. And it doesn't explain why the dancing spread from person to person, or why it affected some people but not others who presumably ate from the same grain supply. Others have proposed mass psychogenic illness, what used to be called mass hysteria, though that term carries unfortunate connotations. In conditions of extreme stress, tight-knit communities can sometimes experience collective psychological symptoms. The phenomenon is well documented across cultures and centuries. The laughing epidemic in Tanganyika in 1962, the meowing nuns of medieval France, the phantom pregnancy that affected an entire convent in Italy. In this interpretation, Strasbourg in 1518 was a pressure cooker of stress and fear. Years of bad harvests had brought hunger to many households. Disease outbreaks were common. The social order was being challenged by religious reformation. People lived with constant uncertainty, constant dread. In such conditions, one person's breakdown could trigger others, especially in a culture where dancing manias were already part of the collective consciousness. There were earlier outbreaks in the 1370s and 1410s. Perhaps Frau Troffea began dancing in a state of extreme psychological distress. Perhaps others, seeing her, felt something unlock in their own minds, a permission to express their own suffering through movement, or a sympathetic triggering of similar psychological states. The city's response, building stages, hiring musicians, encouraging dancing, may have actually reinforced and spread the phenomenon rather than curing it. The anthropologist John Waller has proposed a particularly compelling version of this theory. He suggests that the dancers were in a trance state, induced by psychological stress and sustained by cultural beliefs about St. Vitus's curse. In the medieval worldview, if you believed that St. Vitus could curse you with uncontrollable dancing, then under sufficient stress, your mind might produce exactly that symptom. The belief became self-fulfilling, spreading through a population primed by hardship and fear. But perhaps the most honest answer is that we don't know. We stand 500 years away from that summer in Strasbourg, separated not just by time, but by entirely different ways of understanding the world. The people who witnessed the dancing plague wrote about it in terms of humors and saints and divine intervention. We analyze it through the lens of neurology and psychology and social dynamics. Both approaches are trying to impose order on something that may resist easy explanation. What we can say with certainty is that something happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 that pushed dozens or hundreds of people beyond the limits of ordinary human behavior. They danced when every instinct should have told them to stop. They danced through pain and exhaustion. They danced, some of them, unto death. There's something profoundly unsettling about the dancing plague, even at a distance of centuries. It reminds us how fragile the boundary is between order and chaos, between the self-controlled individual and something that can override will and reason. It shows us a community trying desperately to understand and respond to a crisis that defied all their categories of explanation. But there's also something almost heartbreaking in imagining those dancers. Whatever drove them to move, poison or stress or belief or some combination we can't quite name, they were suffering. Frau Troffea, dancing alone in that street, unable to stop. The others who joined her, swept up in something larger than themselves. They were people in pain, people pushed beyond endurance, people whose bodies expressed what their minds perhaps could not articulate. This is too much. This world is too much. Something has to change. In the centuries since 1518, we've developed new vocabularies for suffering, new ways to understand and treat psychological distress. We no longer believe that saints send curses of involuntary dancing. We have different explanations, hopefully better treatments. But we still live in a world where stress can manifest in the body, where collective trauma can create collective symptoms, where sometimes the pressure of being human in difficult times exceeds what the individual psyche can bear. The narrow streets of Strasbourg are still there, mostly, though the medieval city has been overlaid with later constructions. The Rhine still flows past its walls. Life goes on, as it always does, layering the present over the past. But somewhere in the summer heat, if you listen carefully, you might almost hear an echo of frantic music, the shuffle of feet that cannot stop moving, the collective expression of a suffering we can glimpse but never quite fully comprehend. The dancing plague of 1518 ended eventually, as all things do. The dancers stopped dancing. The city returned to normal. Life continued. But for a few weeks in that summer, Strasbourg had become something strange, a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where the boundary between the possible and impossible grew thin, where a city danced and no one could say exactly why. And perhaps that's the real lesson of that strange summer, that there are moments when our carefully constructed explanations fail us, when human beings do things that resist easy categorization, when the world reveals itself to be stranger and more troubling than we'd like to believe. The dancing plague reminds us that we don't have all the answers, that suffering can take forms we don't expect, that communities can be swept up in collective experiences that defy simple explanation. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you can let go of the need to fully understand. The dancers of Strasbourg are gone now. Their suffering ended, their story preserved in fragmentary records and scholarly debates. Whatever compelled them to dance has released them. They rest now, as you can rest, as we all must eventually rest. The summer of 1518 passed into autumn, and then into winter, and then into the centuries. The Rhine flows on. The city sleeps and wakes and sleeps again. And somewhere in the space between explanation and mystery, the dancers of Strasbourg continue their impossible dance in our imagination, reminding us that the world is strange, that suffering takes many forms, and that sometimes the only response to the inexplicable is simply to witness it, to remember it, and to let it teach us compassion for all the ways human beings struggle under burdens we cannot fully see. Rest now. The dancing has stopped. The summer has passed. All is quiet in the streets of Strasbourg.